Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Adam Rapp, and I'm joined with Sandy Plunkett today. We're going to be reviewing a piece of an original comic art that showed up in January 1944. This piece was done by H.C. Kiefer, who did the pencils, the inks, and the coloring. This original piece showed up in Heroic Comics number 22, which you can see in this picture. Heroic Comics was famous for its wartime stories and often had short stories about war heroes and their effort during World War II. This issue is no different, as we can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this cover. This story focuses on Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore. Now you might ask, why would they write a story about this guy? Well, simply, he was an animal. He had his throat slit by thugs in Panama. He took down 6 Japanese ships while in the Navy during World War II. And in his final battle, he approached 4 Japanese vessels in the darkness of night. One of the Japanese ships saw the submarine and rammed the sub while he was on the bridge. They then released gunfire, shooting Gilmore but not killing him. He commanded the ship to dive, even though he couldn't make it inside, sacrificing himself to save the lives of others. If we go back to the original art that we can see here, there's a lot of different pieces and parts to talk about. There's some specific iconic images I'd like to talk about, but before we do that, let's take a look at the final colored piece that was used in the actual comic. Here we can see the colored piece, where I would argue that sometimes we lose a little bit of detail from the original art. What's interesting to point out is the octopus, the Japanese octopus, and the coloring of it. If you notice, with the yellow skin and the monster-like or unhuman-like features and attributes, this was pretty common in the World War II time comics, as they wanted to make the Japanese and the Nazis look more like monsters rather than humans, to instill fear for those fighting the war and the evils of Nazi Germany. Focusing in on one piece of the art, if we see the octopus, right, we see that this was pretty common during World War II time comics and publications, as we can see in the above images. It was common to show Hitler as an octopus or the Japanese as an octopus with their arms or tentacles wrapped around the world, representing how they were trying to take over the entire world and what they would do in these situations or circumstances. Focusing in on the specific panel on the bottom left-hand corner, I wanted to point out the sketch that's next to the text box. This is called marginalia, where an artist would do or practice art or sketches on a completed piece. For many folks, this is found to be very collectible and something that really demonstrates the artist, as they're working and just going through their art, as they're practicing as they do even on a finished piece sometimes. Now let me turn it over to Sandy Plunkett for more discussion on the page.
Hi there, this is Sandy taking over. My job here is to focus in a little bit more on the art style. The page that we are starting this series with is not exceptional in terms of its technique or the drawing prowess of the artist. But it's it gives us a chance to look into something of a dichotomy in comic book artists of the Golden Age. There were some that had styles that really lent themselves to superhero material. There's others who tended to have a style that lent itself more to realistic features. And this fellow Kiefer, we're still not sure how to pronounce his name, definitely fell into the category of the more realistically oriented comic book styles. This page, even though it starts with a fantasy element, when you go further into the story, you find out that no, it's not a fantasy. This is just a symbolic drawing. He's using a real life character and he's drawing in a real life manner. He was a very prolific artist in the Golden Age, and one of his clients was Gilberton, who published Classic Illustrated. It was a very well-known and popular comic at the time. here you have an example of a classic story, Prince and the Pauper, and focusing on the art style again, you see a certain stiffness or unnatural quality to the faces and the figures. They don't have the flow that you would hope to find in a superhero book. He took time with this page. There's detail, there's real research in the costumes, but there is not the kind of visual imagination that you would hope for in a more fantasy-oriented strip. This is a contemporary of Kiefer's, Lou Fine. Lou Fine is on the other side of the ledger. He is an excellent example of what you can do with superheroes. And when I say what can you do, I mean the extent of exaggeration that you can put in there, the extent of expression you get in figure positioning. That top panel in particular is wonderful. The hand coming out at you is quite a bit larger than it would be realistically. It kind of anticipates the sort of foreshortening that Neil Adams later did, where he was trying to get a real strong sense of impact. The other three panels below are a little bit tamer in comparison, but that's because we're now getting into the story and we're not really doing this large symbolic features. Okay. Kiefer didn't just do strictly adaptions of classic novels or wartime hero, realistic type people. He did jungle type books. This is one of them, Nayoka, the Jungle Girl, a very popular character at the time, popular enough so that she had a movie serial made of her. One of the series that showed up on Saturday morning matinees in the theaters in the 30s and 40s. He did a few others, but they were in the same vein, more or less realistic and not strong on the fantasy elements. I find it interesting to look back on heroic comics because the title changed pretty significantly with the onset of World War II. It started off in the 1940s, I believe, being another book that showcased a bunch of superheroes. I think it's notable that Bill Everett introduced his first of three water-based heroes in the pages of heroic comics. Hydra Man, and I think the next one was Fin Man, and the third one was the well-known Prince Namor, the Submariner that Marvel rescued from the graveyard of Golden Age heroes and brought back with the Avengers. And I think that is where we're going to end for this session.